The moment Clara Monroe stepped off that dusty train in Dry Creek, she never imagined the man who'd promised her a future would take one look at her petite frame and declare her worthless. Too small, George Penner sneered, his words cutting deeper than any blade. But sometimes the smallest flames burn the brightest, and when a quiet rancher named Jack Callahan saw what others missed, everything changed. Stay with me, friends, and discover how one woman's rejection became her greatest triumph. Comment below which town you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. The iron beast of a locomotive released its final hiss of steam as it came to rest at Dry Creek Station, Wyoming Territory, on a sweltering afternoon in late August 1882. The platform buzzed with the usual chaos of arrivals and departures, families reuniting, merchants hauling goods, and travelers stretching their weary limbs after days confined to narrow passenger cars. Among them, a young woman stood apart, not because she commanded attention with her presence, but rather because she seemed to disappear into it, like a sparrow among eagles. Clara Monroe was 23 years old, though her diminutive stature often led people to mistake her for someone much younger. Standing barely 5 feet tall in her worn traveling boots, she possessed the kind of delicate features that might have graced a china doll, porcelain skin kissed by freckles across her nose, eyes the color of prairie grass after rain, and auburn hair that she'd pinned up in a style that had lost its elegance somewhere between Chicago and the endless plains of Nebraska. Her dress, a practical gray wool that had seen better days, hung on her small frame like a shroud of uncertainty. She clutched a leather valise in one hand and a letter in the other, the letter that had brought her 2,000 miles from the suffocating confines of a Boston tenement to this raw frontier town. The paper had grown soft from constant handling, its creases worn thin from the countless times she'd unfolded it during the journey, reading and rereading the words that promised her a new life. "My dearest Miss Monroe," the letter had begun in George Penner's confident script. "Your advertisement in the Matrimonial Times has captured my attention most thoroughly. A woman of good breeding and education is precisely what my ranch requires. I am a man of considerable means here in Wyoming Territory, with 3,000 acres of prime cattle land and a fine house that awaits a woman's touch. I seek not merely a wife, but a partner in building an empire in this untamed land. Your photographs suggest you possess both the beauty and refinement I desire. Please accept the enclosed train fare as proof of my sincere intentions. I await your arrival with great anticipation." Clara had memorized every word, had built dreams upon each carefully penned promise. In Boston, she'd been nothing more than a seamstress in a dark factory, her fingers bleeding from 12-hour days bent over fine fabrics she could never afford to wear. Her parents dead from consumption. Her brother lost to a mining accident in Pennsylvania. She had no one and nothing keeping her tethered to the East. The advertisement she'd placed in the Matrimonial Times had been an act of desperation disguised as adventure. Educated woman of good moral character, skilled in domestic arts, seeks correspondence with gentleman rancher in Western Territories. Willing to travel for matrimony with honorable man of means. George Penner's response had seemed like divine providence. Now, as she scanned the crowd at Dry Creek Station, her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. She recognized him immediately from the photograph he'd sent, tall, broad-shouldered, with sandy hair and a mustache waxed to perfection. George Penner stood near a gleaming black carriage, dressed in a suit that must have cost more than she'd earned in a year. He was handsome in the way that men with money often were, his confidence adding inches to his already impressive height. "Mr. Penner!" Clara's voice came out smaller than she intended as she approached him, her valise suddenly feeling like it weighed 100 pounds. George turned, his blue eyes scanning right over her at first, looking for someone else entirely. Then his gaze dropped down, way down, and landed on Clara. The transformation in his expression was immediate and devastating. The warm smile he'd been wearing froze, then crumbled like a sandcastle meeting the tide. His eyes, which had held such promise in his letters, turned cold as a January morning. "You're Clara Monroe?" The disbelief in his voice made her name sound like an accusation. "Yes, sir, I am." She lifted her chin, trying to add height she didn't possess. "I've come as you requested, Mr. Penner. The journey was long, but the photograph," he interrupted, his voice rising enough that people nearby began to take notice. The photograph you sent showed. It didn't show. He gestured vaguely at all of her, his hand movement encompassing her entire diminutive form. Heat flooded Clara's cheeks. The photograph was accurate, Mr. Penner. Perhaps the photographer's perspective. Perspective. George laughed, but there was no humor in it. The sound was sharp, cutting. No perspective could hide this deception. You're barely bigger than a child. How did you imagine you could handle ranch work? How could you possibly? He stopped himself, but his eyes finished the sentence his mouth wouldn't. How could you possibly be what I need? The crowd that had been pretending not to watch now gave up all pretense. Women whispered behind gloved hands. Men shifted uncomfortably, some sympathetic, others amused. Clara felt every eye upon her, each gaze a weight pressing down on her shoulders. Mr. Penner, she said, fighting to keep her voice steady, I assure you I am quite capable. My size has never prevented me from hard work. In Boston, Boston. He spat the word like it was something bitter on his tongue. Yes, I'm sure you did fine work in Boston, sitting at a quilting frame or teaching children their letters. But this is Wyoming territory, Miss Monroe. This is cattle country. The women here need to be... He paused, searching for the word. Substantial. They need to pull their weight, literally. They need to be able to help with calving, to handle horses, to survive winters that would freeze your delicate bones to ice. Each word was a blow, precise and calculated. Clara had faced rejection before. What woman of her station hadn't? But never like this, never so public, never so complete. Furthermore, George continued, warming to his theme now that he'd started, what would people think? George Penner, one of the most successful ranchers in the territory, married to someone who looks like she should still be in the schoolyard? I'd be a laughingstock. No, this won't do at all. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a leather wallet, extracting several bills. Here, he said, holding out the money like one might offer scraps to a stray dog. This should cover your return passage to Boston, with a bit extra for your trouble. The eastbound train leaves tomorrow morning. There's a decent boarding house on 2nd Street where you can spend the night. Clara stared at the money in his outstretched hand. It would be so easy to take it, to slink away in defeat, to return to the life she'd tried so hard to escape. Her fingers actually twitched toward it before she caught herself. No, she said quietly. George blinked. Pardon? I said no! Her voice was stronger now, fueled by a combination of humiliation and anger. You invited me here, Mr. Penner. You made promises. I left everything behind based on your word. Based on your deception, you mean, he countered. You misrepresented yourself. I did no such thing. I sent an honest photograph and truthful letters. If you made assumptions about my size based on your own prejudices, that's hardly my fault. A murmur rippled through the crowd. George's face flushed red, whether from anger or embarrassment Clara couldn't tell. Now see here, Miss Monroe. No, you see here, Mr. Penner. Clara took a step forward, and though she had to tilt her head back to look him in the eye, something in her gaze made him take a half-step backward. You speak of what people would think, but what will they think now? That George Penner is the kind of man who invites a woman 2,000 miles only to abandon her at the train station because she doesn't meet his shallow expectations. Shallow? George's voice rose to near shouting. Practical is not shallow, miss. I need a wife who can be a partner, not a burden. Someone who can contribute to the ranch, not someone I'd have to coddle and protect from every strong wind that blows across the prairie. And you determined all of this in less than 2 minutes of conversation? Clara shot back. You know nothing of my capabilities, my strength, my determination. You see only my height and make judgments about my entire worth as a human being. I see, George said coldly. Exactly what I need to see. You're too small, too delicate, too Eastern. You wouldn't last a month out here, and I won't waste my time or resources finding out I'm right. He thrust the money toward her again. Take it and go home, Miss Monroe. Find yourself a nice clerk or shopkeeper in Boston who won't mind having a wife he could carry in his pocket. This territory requires more than you can offer. The crowd held its collective breath. Clara looked at the money, then at George's face. handsome, cruel, certain of his rightness. She thought of the factory in Boston, of her bleeding fingers and empty stomach, of the darkness that had driven her to answer an advertisement for a mail-order bride in the first place. She thought of all the hopes she'd carried across half a continent, now crumbling like dust at her feet. But she also thought of her mother, dead at 35, who'd told her with her last breath, "Never let them make you small, Clara. You're already small enough." "Keep your money, Mr. Penner," Clara said, her voice carrying across the platform with surprising strength. "I'd rather starve in Wyoming than take charity from a man who judges books by their covers and women by their height. I came here to build a life, and that's what I intend to do, with or without you." She turned on her heel, picked up her valise, and began walking away from the station, having no idea where she was going, but knowing she couldn't stand there another moment under George's contemptuous gaze and the crowd's pitying stares. "You won't last a week," George called after her. "This territory eats people like you for breakfast." Clara didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge his words, though they followed her like wolves nipping at her heels. The crowd parted to let her pass, some faces sympathetic, others merely curious about what the small woman would do next. She'd made it perhaps 50 yards from the station, her mind racing to figure out her next move. She had a little money saved, enough for a few nights' lodging while she looked for work, though what work would there be for someone George Penner had so publicly declared useless, when she heard footsteps behind her. "Miss!" The voice was different from George's, deeper, rougher, without the polished edges that money and education provided. Clara turned to find a man standing a respectful distance away, holding his worn hat in his hands. He wasn't handsome, not in the way George Penner was handsome. This man looked like he'd been carved from the landscape itself, weathered, solid, permanent. His face was tanned to leather by countless days under the Wyoming sun, with lines around his eyes that spoke of either laughter or squinting into distance, perhaps both. His hair was dark, shot through with premature silver at the temples, and his clothes, while clean, bore the unmistakable marks of hard use. He was tall, though not as tall as George, and broad in a way that suggested strength earned through labor, not inherited through good breeding. "Miss," he said again, "I couldn't help but overhear what just happened back there." "Then you've had your entertainment for the day," Clara said stiffly, clutching her valise tighter. "If you'll excuse me." "Wasn't entertaining," the man interrupted. "Was shameful what Penner did. Man invites a lady all this way. He ought to at least give her a chance to prove herself." Clara studied him warily. "And I suppose you're here to offer me that chance?" "Maybe." He shifted his weight, uncomfortable but determined. "Name's Jack Callahan. I've got a ranch about 10 miles north of here. Nothing fancy like Penner's spread, just 600 acres, couple hundred head of cattle, and more work than one man can handle." "And you're offering me work?" Clara tried to keep the desperation out of her voice. "Offering you honesty," Jack said. "The work's hard. Harder than anything you've probably done. The pay's fair, but not generous. You'd have your own cabin, small but clean, and 3 meals a day. But I won't lie to you and say it'll be easy, and I won't pretend I'm doing it out of charity." "Then why?" Clara asked. Jack was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh his words. "Because I've been watching George Penner judge people by their covers for the 5 years I've been here, and I've seen him be wrong more often than right. Because my ma was a small woman too, barely came up to my pa's shoulder, but she could outwork any man I knew. And because—" He paused, then met her eyes directly. "Because anyone who can stand up to George Penner the way you just did has got the kind of backbone this territory actually needs." Clara considered him, this rough stranger offering her not promises but honesty. "You don't even know if I can do the work." "Nope," Jack agreed. "And you don't know if you can either. But seems to me you came out here to find out what you're capable of, not to be told what you're not. Question is, do you still want to find out?" Behind them, Clara could hear the train preparing to depart, carrying away some people's dreams and delivering others. She could see George Penner's carriage pulling away from the station, its black polish gleaming like a beetle's shell in the sun. She could feel the eyes of the town upon her, waiting to see what the tiny woman from Boston would do. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "I don't know anything about cattle." "Can you learn?" I don't know how to ride a horse. Can you learn? I've never lived anywhere that didn't have gas lights and paved streets. Can you adapt? Clara looked at him, this man who wasn't offering her romance or riches, just work and possibility. I can try. Jack nodded, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. That's all anyone can do. My wagon's over behind the general store. We can pick up supplies you'll need, work clothes that actually fit, proper boots, that sort of thing. You can pay me back out of your wages if you stay. If you decide to leave, we'll call it even. And if I fail? Clara asked. If it turns out George Penner was right about me? Jack settled his hat back on his head, and for the first time she saw him truly smile. It transformed his weathered face into something almost kind. Then at least you'll fail trying, Miss Monroe. That's more than most people ever do. Clara looked back one last time at the train station, at the world she'd left behind, and the one that had rejected her before she'd even had a chance to try. Then she turned to Jack Callahan and nodded. Lead the way, Mr. Callahan. As they walked toward his wagon, Clara heard someone in the crowd say, That little thing won't last 3 days on the Callahan place. Another voice responded, George Penner might have just made the biggest mistake of his life. Clara didn't know which prediction would prove true, but as she walked beside Jack Callahan, her valise in one hand and her determination in the other, she realized something. For the first time since her parents died, she was walking toward something unknown, without fear. The rejection at the train station had stripped away her illusions, her romantic notions about the West and her place in it. What remained was something harder, cleaner, more honest. The wagon was exactly what Clara had expected, sturdy, practical, worn, but well-maintained. Jack helped her up onto the bench seat, his hands careful and respectful, then loaded her valise in the back. The general store first, he said, climbing up beside her. Martha Henderson runs it, and she'll kit you out proper. Fair warning. She's going to have opinions about what happened at the station. The whole town will have opinions, Clara said. True enough. Question is, do you care? Clara thought about it as Jack guided the horses onto the main street. An hour ago, I would have said yes. Now I think I care more about proving them wrong than worrying about what they think. Jack made a sound that might have been approval. That's a good start, Miss Monroe. The general store was bustling when they arrived. Clara could feel the conversation's pause as she entered, could sense the weight of curious and speculative gazes. Martha Henderson, a woman built like a pickle barrel with a face to match, looked Clara up and down with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for livestock at auction. So you're the one George Penner rejected, Martha said without preamble. I'm the one who refused to be sent back east like damaged goods, Clara corrected. Martha's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been respect flickering in her eyes. And now Jack here's taking you on at his place. I'm hiring her, Jack said firmly. Same as I'd hire any hand who needed work and was willing to learn. Uh-huh. Martha's tone suggested she wasn't buying it entirely, but she moved on to business. What does she need? What followed was an education in frontier practicality. Martha outfitted Clara with split skirts made of heavy canvas, men's shirts that would have to be taken in considerably, work boots that required 3 pairs of socks to fit properly, leather gloves that would protect her hands, and a wide-brimmed hat to shield her from the sun. You'll want these too, Martha said, adding long underwear to the pile. Winter comes early and hard here. Those tiny bones of yours won't keep you warm. Clara bristled at the reference to her size but held her tongue. She was learning already that pride was a luxury she couldn't afford, at least not yet. The total was more than she'd expected, more than she had. Jack paid without comment, adding the debt to whatever mental tally he was keeping. One more thing, Martha said as they prepared to leave. She reached under the counter and pulled out a small revolver, a .32 caliber piece that looked almost like a toy compared to the Colts most men carried. This is more your size? You'll need it, living out there alone. I don't know how to shoot, Clara admitted. Jack will teach you, Martha said, looking at Jack rather than Clara. Won't you, Jack? If she wants to learn. Clara picked up the gun, surprised by its weight despite its small size. I want to learn everything. Martha actually smiled at that, though it looked unpracticed on her stern face. Maybe you'll surprise us all, little one. As they loaded the supplies into the wagon, Clara caught sight of George Penner across the street, emerging from the bank. He saw her too, saw her in her new work clothes standing beside Jack Callahan's wagon. His expression was unreadable at this distance, but Clara thought she saw him shake his head before turning away. "Having second thoughts?" Jack asked, following her gaze. "No," Clara said firmly. "Just wondering how wrong one man can be." The ride to Jack's ranch took them through landscape that was both beautiful and terrifying in its vastness. The mountains rose in the distance like ancient gods, their peaks already white with early snow. The prairie stretched endlessly, grass rippling like a golden ocean in the wind. Clara had never seen so much sky, had never felt so small and yet so free. "It's overwhelming at first," Jack said, noticing her wide-eyed expression. "The space. People from back east, they're used to boundaries, walls, limits. Out here, the only limits are the ones you put on yourself." "Or the ones others put on you," Clara said, thinking of George's dismissal. "Those too," Jack agreed. "But those are the ones you can prove wrong." They passed other ranches, other homesteads carved out of the wilderness. Some were grand affairs like what Clara imagined George Penner's must be. Others were little more than sodden houses and hope. Jack pointed out landmarks, explained the invisible boundaries that marked one spread from another, told her the names of the mountains that would become her constant companions. "That's Storm Peak," he said, indicating a particularly imposing summit. "When clouds gather there, you've got maybe 2 hours before the weather hits. You learn to read the signs, or you learn to suffer." "And if you can't learn," Clara asked. "Then the territory spits you back out to wherever you came from," Jack said simply. "It's not cruel, just honest. The land doesn't care about your feelings or your plans. It just is, and you either work with it or against it." As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that Clara had never seen in Boston's sooty atmosphere, they finally arrived at Jack's ranch. It wasn't impressive, not compared to what she'd imagined when George Penner had written about his empire. There was a main house, sturdy but modest, built of logs chinked with mud. A barn that had seen better days but still stood strong against the wind. Several corrals, a smokehouse, a henhouse, and set apart from the rest, a small cabin that Jack indicated would be hers. "It's not much," Jack said, and Clara heard a note of apology in his voice. "It's honest," Clara replied, unconsciously echoing his earlier words. "That's more than I had this morning." The cabin was indeed small, one room with a stove for heating and cooking, a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, shelves for storage, and not much else. But it was clean, as Jack had promised, and it was hers, at least for now. "You'll take your meals at the main house," Jack said, setting her valise inside. "Breakfast at dawn, dinner at dusk. Lunch you'll usually eat wherever the work takes you. Speaking of which, we start tomorrow, 5 o'clock. "In the morning?" Clara couldn't hide her dismay. "Cattle don't care if you're tired," Jack said. "Neither does the work. I'll teach you what I can, but ultimately you'll either develop the strength and skills you need, or you won't." "You sound like you're expecting me to fail," Clara said. Jack was quiet for a moment, looking out the cabin's single window at the darkening sky. "I'm expecting you to struggle. Everyone does at first. The difference between those who make it and those who don't isn't size or strength or even skill. It's the willingness to get up every time you fall, to try again every time you fail, to push past the point where everything in you wants to quit." He turned to look at her then, and in the fading light, Clara thought she saw something in his eyes. Not pity, not doubt, but a kind of cautious hope. "George Penner was wrong about one thing for certain," Jack said. "This territory doesn't require any particular type of person. It just requires that whatever type you are, you're willing to become more. The question is, Miss Monroe, are you?" Clara thought about the train that would leave tomorrow morning, heading back east, back to safety and familiarity and slow death by 1,000 small surrenders. She thought about George Penner, so certain of her inadequacy. She thought about the crowd at the station, waiting to see her fail. Then she thought about her mother's words. "Never let them make you small, Clara. You're already small enough." "I am, Mr. Callahan," she said. "I'm willing to become whatever I need to become." Jack nodded, satisfied. "Then I'll see you at 5. Wear those new work clothes and be prepared to get them dirty. Tomorrow, your real education begins. As Jack left her alone in the cabin that would be her new home, Clara lit the oil lamp and took stock of her situation. This morning, she'd been a prospective bride, arriving to start a new life of partnership and possibly love. Tonight, she was a hired hand on a modest ranch, with calluses to earn and skeptics to prove wrong. She pulled out the letter from George Penner, the one that had brought her all this way. She considered burning it, but decided to keep it instead, not as a romantic remembrance, but as a reminder of how wrong people could be when they judged by appearances alone. Outside, she could hear the cattle lowing in the distance, could hear the wind picking up as night settled over the prairie. It was a lonely sound, but also somehow comforting. It was the sound of life continuing regardless of human drama, of nature's indifference to her small struggles. Clara Monroe, all 5 feet of her, stood in the doorway of her cabin and looked out at the vast Wyoming sky, now brilliant with stars she'd never seen through Boston's smoke and fog. She was small, yes. Alone, certainly. But for the first time in her life, she was also unlimited by others' expectations. Tomorrow would bring challenges she couldn't imagine. The work would be harder than anything she'd known. Jack Callahan might prove to be harsh taskmaster or worse. She might indeed fail, might prove George Penner right, might end up on that eastbound train after all. But tonight, under the endless western sky, Clara Monroe felt something she hadn't felt since her parents died. The fierce, burning certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be. Not because it was easy or comfortable or safe, but because it was the place where she would finally discover what she was truly made of. The rejection at Dry Creek Station had been meant to break her. Instead, it had freed her from the last of her illusions. Now the real work could begin. As she prepared for bed in her small cabin, Clara thought she heard wolves howling in the distance. Or perhaps it was just the wind. Either way, it was the sound of the wild calling, and something wild in her answered back. Tomorrow, she would begin to prove them all wrong. Or she would fail trying. Either way, she would do it on her own terms, at her own height, with her own strength. And that, Clara thought as sleep finally took her, was already a victory in itself. The rooster's crow came far too early, piercing through the thin walls of Clara's cabin like an accusation. For a moment she lay in the narrow bed, disoriented, her body aching from the unfamiliar mattress and the emotional toll of yesterday's humiliation. Then reality crashed back. She was in Wyoming, on Jack Callahan's ranch, and she had exactly 10 minutes to dress and present herself for her first day of work. Her new clothes felt strange against her skin, the rough canvas of the split skirt nothing like the cotton and wool she was accustomed to. The boots, even with 3 pairs of socks, felt like boats on her small feet. She caught her reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin and barely recognized herself. Gone was the Boston seamstress with her carefully pinned hair and modest dress. In her place stood something unfinished, uncertain, neither Eastern nor Western, neither lady nor ranch hand. Jack was already at the main house when she arrived, sitting at a rough wooden table with a cup of coffee that seemed to steam with the same quiet intensity as the man himself. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. "Coffee's on the stove," he said simply. "Breakfast is whatever you can make from what's in the pantry. We eat quick and simple during the week." Clara found eggs, bacon, and day-old biscuits. She'd cooked in cramped Boston kitchens all her life, but this was different. The massive cast-iron stove seemed to have its own temperament, running either too hot or barely warm. Jack watched her struggle with the dampers and drafts without comment, though she thought she caught something that might have been amusement in his eyes. "The stove has opinions," she said finally, managing to get the bacon sizzling at something approaching the right temperature. "Everything out here has opinions," Jack replied. "The stove, the weather, the horses, the cattle. Your job is to learn their language and convince them to cooperate. And if they won't, then you learn to work around them. Force doesn't work with most things out here. Understanding does." They ate in relative silence, Clara stealing glances at this strange man who'd offered her a chance when everyone else would have seen her on the next train back east. In the morning light filtering through the windows, she could see more details. The scar that ran along his jaw, the calluses on his hands that spoke of years of hard labor, the way he held himself with a careful stillness that suggested either great patience or great pain. "First thing," Jack said, pushing back from the table, You need to meet the livestock. Can't work with animals you're afraid of. The barn was a cathedral of shadows and dust motes, filled with the warm smell of hay and horses. Clara had seen horses in Boston, of course, pulling carriages and wagons through the streets. But those had been tired, docile creatures, broken to harness and routine. These horses were different. They moved with a fluid grace that spoke of power barely contained, their eyes bright with intelligence and something that might have been judgment. "This is Buttercup," Jack said, leading her to a stall where a massive golden mare stood watching them with liquid brown eyes. "Don't let the name fool you. She's got opinions about everything and everyone." Clara approached carefully, her hand extended as Jack showed her. The mare sniffed her fingers, then snorted, sending Clara stumbling backward. "She says you smell like fear," Jack observed. "Horses are like mirrors. They reflect what you bring to them. Bring fear, they give you reasons to be afraid. Bring calm confidence, even if you're faking it, and they'll usually meet you halfway." "How do I fake confidence when she's 10 times my size?" Clara asked, eyeing the mare's massive hooves. "Same way you stood up to George Penner yesterday. You decide you're bigger than your body." It took an hour before Buttercup would let Clara brush her without dancing away. Another hour before Clara could lead her around the corral without feeling like she was walking a barely controlled avalanche. By mid-morning, her arms ached from holding the lead rope. Her feet hurt from her 2 big boots, and she'd been stepped on twice. Lightly, Jack assured her, as if that made her throbbing toes feel better. "Now the cattle," Jack said, and Clara's heart sank. The cattle were nothing like the docile cows she'd imagined. These were range cattle, half-wild creatures with horns like weapons and temperaments that varied from skittish to outright aggressive. Jack taught her to read their body language, the way they held their heads, the position of their ears, the subtle shifts in posture that preceded a charge. "Never run from a cow," he instructed as they stood outside the corral watching the herd. "Running makes you prey. Stand your ground. Make yourself big. Yell if you have to. They're testing you, seeing if you're worth respecting." Easy for him to say, Clara thought, as a particularly large steer fixed her with a baleful stare. Jack stood 6 feet tall and had the build of someone who'd wrestled nature his whole life. She looked like something the wind might blow away. As if reading her thoughts, a young bull suddenly broke from the herd and charged the fence where Clara stood. She wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but Jack's hand on her shoulder held her steady. "Stand," he said quietly. "Don't give an inch." The bull stopped just short of the fence, snorting and pawing the ground. Clara's heart was thundering so hard she was sure everyone in Wyoming could hear it, but she held her ground. After what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, the bull turned and ambled back to the herd. "Good," Jack said, and Clara realized it was the first real praise he'd offered. "You might survive out here after all." The days that followed blurred together into a symphony of exhaustion and small victories. Clara learned to muck stalls without gagging at the smell, to carry water buckets that weighed nearly as much as she did, to scatter feed while avoiding the aggressive roosters that seemed to view her as a personal affront to their dominion. Jack was a patient, if demanding teacher. He never coddled her, never made allowances for her size or gender, but he also never mocked her struggles or compared her to others. When she couldn't lift a hay bale, he showed her how to use leverage and momentum instead of brute strength. When she couldn't reach something, he taught her to use tools or find creative solutions rather than simply fetching it for her. "You're not trying to be someone else," he told her one evening as she struggled to repair a section of fence. "You're trying to be the best version of yourself. That means working with what you have, not wishing for what you don't." "What if what I have isn't enough?" Clara asked, her hands bleeding despite the heavy gloves, her whole body aching from another 12-hour day. Jack was quiet for a moment, looking out at the sunset painting the mountains purple and gold. "My mother was about your size," he said finally. "Came out here from Ireland when she was 17. Everyone said she'd never make it, too small, too delicate. She buried 2 husbands and raised 3 sons on this land. When she died at 73, she was still splitting her own firewood." What was her secret? No secret. She just never quit. Every day she got up and did what needed doing. Some days that wasn't much. Other days it was everything. But she never quit. Clara thought about that as she fell into bed each night, too tired to even remove her boots sometimes. She thought about it when her hands cracked and bled, when her muscles screamed in protest, when the other ranch hands from neighboring spreads laughed at the sight of her trying to wrestle a calf or chase escaped chickens. Word of her situation had spread through the territory like wildfire. Some people came by just to see Penner's reject, as she'd heard herself called in town. They would arrive on various pretexts, borrowing tools, discussing cattle prices with Jack. But Clara knew they were really there to see if she'd failed yet. George Penner himself rode by one day, ostensibly to discuss water rights with Jack. Clara was in the corral, covered in mud from head to toe after losing a battle with a particularly stubborn pig. George sat on his magnificent black stallion, immaculate in his pressed clothes, and watched her with an expression of amused disdain. "Still playing at being a ranch hand, I see," he called out. Clara straightened, mud dripping from her hair, and met his gaze squarely. "Still playing at being a gentleman, I see," she replied. Jack, who'd been standing nearby, made a sound that might have been a covered laugh. George's face flushed red. "When you're ready to admit defeat," George said, "my offer of train fare still stands." "When you're ready to admit you were wrong," Clara countered, "I'll accept your apology." George rode off without another word, but Clara could feel his anger lingering like smoke in the air. "You're making an enemy there," Jack warned. "I made an enemy the moment I refused to disappear," Clara replied. "At least now it's an honest one." As the weeks passed, something began to change. Clara's hands grew calloused and strong. Her arms, once suited only for fine needlework, developed lean muscle from hauling water and feed. She learned to move with the rhythm of ranch life, to anticipate the needs of animals and land. She could now saddle Buttercup without help, though she still needed a mounting block to get on the mare's broad back. More importantly, she began to earn something she'd never expected: respect. Not from everyone, certainly not from George Penner and his circle, but from the people who mattered. Martha Henderson at the general store nodded approvingly when Clara came in to buy supplies, her clothes properly dirty from honest work. Tom Rivers, who ran the neighboring ranch to the west, tipped his hat to her one day and said, "You're tougher than you look, Miss Monroe." Even the hands Jack occasionally hired for bigger jobs began to treat her less like a joke and more like a fellow worker. She was still the little one, or Penner's reject to some, but increasingly she was also Miss Clara who could doctor a sick calf, or that tiny woman who faced down Murphy's bull. The real test came on a storm-dark October day, when Jack's prediction about reading the weather proved prophetic. Clara had been checking the fence line in the far pasture when she noticed the clouds gathering around Storm Peak. 2 hours, Jack had said. She had perhaps 30 minutes to get the cattle to shelter before the storm hit. The problem was, she was alone. Jack had gone to town for supplies, trusting her to handle the routine work. Moving 40 head of cattle single-handedly would be challenging for an experienced hand. For Clara, it seemed impossible, but impossible had become a word she no longer accepted. She saddled Buttercup with shaking hands, the mare sensing the approaching storm and dancing nervously. Clara had only been riding for a few weeks, and never in conditions like this. The wind was picking up, sending her hair whipping around her face despite her hat. The cattle were nervous too, bunching together and lowing anxiously. "All right, Buttercup," Clara said, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. "We need to get them to the barn. You know what to do, even if I don't." What followed was the longest hour of Clara's life. She and Buttercup worked to move the herd, Clara relying more on the horse's instincts than her own skill. When the cattle tried to scatter, she remembered Jack's lessons. Make yourself big, use your voice, don't show fear. She yelled and waved her hat, probably looking ridiculous, but somehow effective. When a young steer broke from the herd, Buttercup knew to chase it before Clara even realized what was happening. The first fat raindrops began falling as they neared the barn. Then the sky opened up entirely, releasing a torrent that turned the ground to mud in seconds. Clara could barely see through the rain, her clothes instantly soaked through, but she kept pushing. One stubborn cow decided this was the perfect time to stand still, and Clara had to dismount and literally push the animal, her small frame straining against its massive bulk. "Move!" she screamed over the thunder. "I didn't come all the way from Boston to lose you to stubbornness." Whether the cow understood her words or just decided cooperation was easier than continued resistance, it finally moved. Clara remounted Buttercup with difficulty, her wet clothes making everything harder, and they got the last of the herd into the barn just as the storm reached its full fury. She was closing the barn doors, fighting against the wind that wanted to tear them from their hinges, when Jack appeared out of the rain like a ghost. Without a word, he added his strength to hers, and together they secured the doors. They stood there for a moment, both soaked to the skin, Clara shaking from cold and adrenaline. Jack looked at the cattle, all safe and accounted for in the barn, then at Clara, muddy and bedraggled but triumphant. "You got them all in," he said, and there was something in his voice Clara hadn't heard before, genuine surprise mixed with what might have been pride. "Buttercup did most of the work," Clara said through chattering teeth. "Buttercup doesn't work for people she doesn't respect," Jack replied. "Neither do cattle." "You did this." That night, as they sat by the fire in the main house, Clara wrapped in a blanket and slowly warming up, Jack was unusually talkative. "I had my doubts," he admitted. "When I offered you the job, part of me expected you'd last maybe a week. It wasn't about your size. I told you my mother was small. It was about your softness. You'd never known real hardship, not the physical kind." "And now?" Clara asked. "Now I think George Penner might be the biggest fool in Wyoming territory." Clara felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "I'm still not the wife he wanted." "No," Jack agreed. "You're something better. You're becoming who you're meant to be." There was something in the way he said it, something in the way he looked at her across the firelight that made Clara's heart skip. But before she could examine the feeling, Jack stood abruptly. "Storm's going to last all night," he said. "You should stay here. Take the spare room. That cabin of yours leaks in weather like this." It was the first time Clara had been invited to stay in the main house. The spare room was small but comfortable, with a real feather bed and quilts that smelled of cedar and lavender. As she lay there listening to the storm rage outside, she thought about how much had changed in just a few weeks. She'd come to Wyoming to be a wife, to fulfill someone else's idea of what her life should be. Instead, she'd found something else entirely. Her own strength, her own capability, her own worth, that had nothing to do with her size or appearance. The work was hard, harder than anything she'd known. But it was also honest and real in a way her life in Boston had never been. And then there was Jack. She'd been so focused on surviving, on proving herself, that she hadn't really thought about him beyond his role as her employer and teacher. But lying there in his house, surrounded by the small touches that made it a home, books on the shelves, a painting of Irish countryside on the wall, a rocking chair worn smooth by use, she began to wonder about the man who'd given her a chance when no one else would. The next morning dawned crystal clear, the storm having washed the world clean. Clara found Jack already up, making breakfast with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. "I want to learn to shoot," Clara announced. Jack looked up from the eggs he was scrambling. "Any particular reason?" "Because everyone expects me to fail at it," Clara said honestly. "And because Martha Henderson was right. I need to know how." That afternoon, Jack set up targets behind the barn, tin cans on fence posts, starting close and moving farther back. The little .32 Martha had sold her felt heavy in Clara's small hands, but she was determined. Her first shot went wild, not even close to the target. The second wasn't much better. Jack stood behind her, patient as always, adjusting her stance, her grip, her aim. "You're thinking too much," he said. "Stop trying to force it. Breathe, aim, squeeze. Let the gun do the work." It took 50 rounds before Clara hit her first can. The sound of tin hitting dirt was the sweetest music she'd ever heard. By the end of the week, she could hit 3 out of 5 at 20 paces. It wasn't impressive by frontier standards, but it was progress. "You're a decent shot," Jack said one evening as they cleaned the guns. "With practice, you could be good." "Just decent?" Clara teased, surprising herself with the playful tone. "Well," Jack said, and she caught that ghost of a smile again. "You're also decent at moving cattle, decent at handling horses, decent at reading weather." "So I'm thoroughly decent," Clara laughed. "Decent is good," Jack said, more serious now. "Decent is reliable. Decent gets the work done. I'll take decent over flashy any day." "Is that why you gave me a chance?" Because you prefer decent to flashy? Jack was quiet for a moment, concentrating on oiling his rifle. I gave you a chance because you reminded me of someone. Your mother? No. He set down the rifle and looked at her directly. Myself. When I first came here 5 years ago, I knew nothing about ranching. I'd been a lot of things, soldier, miner, drifter, but never a rancher. Everyone said I'd fail, that I didn't have what it took. But an old man named Samuel Brennan gave me a chance, same as I gave you. He's gone now, but this ranch exists because he believed in second chances and hard work over appearances. What made you leave your old life? Clara asked. Jack's expression closed off slightly. That's a story for another time. We all have things we're running from, Miss Monroe. The trick is to make sure we're running towards something too. November brought the first real snow, transforming the landscape into something from a fairy tale. It also brought new challenges. The cattle needed extra feed, the water troughs froze nightly, and the wind cut through even the heaviest clothes like a knife. Clara learned to layer clothes until she looked like a child's overstuffed doll, to break ice with an axe, to recognize the signs of frostbite in both humans and animals. It was during a particularly harsh cold snap that trouble arrived in the form of 3 men on horseback. Clara was alone at the ranch again. Jack had taken cattle to market in Cheyenne and wouldn't be back for 2 days. She recognized one of the riders immediately, Bill Harper, George Penner's foreman, a man with a reputation for violence and a particular dislike of uppity women, as she'd heard him call her in town. Well, well, Harper said, dismounting without invitation. The little lady's all alone. Clara's hand went to the .32 on her hip, a gesture that made Harper laugh. You planning to shoot us, tiny girl? That pea shooter might annoy us some, but that's about all. It might do more than that if I aim it right, Clara said, trying to keep her voice steady. What do you want, Mr. Harper? Mr. Penner sent us to make you an offer, Harper said, moving closer. Seems he's feeling generous. He'll buy this ranch from Callahan for twice what it's worth, and you can come work in his house. Kitchen work, cleaning, women's work, more suitable for someone of your stature. Mr. Callahan's ranch isn't for sale, Clara said, and neither am I. Harper's expression darkened. Everything's for sale, girl, just depends on the pressure applied. The other 2 men had dismounted now, spreading out slightly. Clara's mouth went dry. She was alone, outsized, outgunned. But she was also standing on Jack's land, her land in a way now, and she'd be damned if she'd show fear to these bullies. The only pressure here, she said, drawing her gun, is the pressure of my finger on this trigger if you don't get off this property. Harper laughed again. You won't shoot. Nice Eastern ladies don't shoot people. Clara aimed at the whiskey bottle sticking out of his saddlebag and fired. The bottle exploded, showering Harper with glass and whiskey. Her second shot took off his hat. The third went into the ground at his feet, close enough to spray dirt on his boots. I'm not a nice Eastern lady anymore, Clara said, cocking the hammer for a 4th shot. I'm a Wyoming ranch hand, and we protect what's ours. Harper's face was purple with rage, but he also looked uncertain now. Clara might be small, but she'd just proven she could shoot and would shoot. This isn't over, he snarled, gathering his ruined hat. Penner wants this land, and what Penner wants, Penner gets. Then Penner's going to be disappointed, Clara replied, keeping the gun trained on them as they mounted their horses. They rode off, Harper shouting threats and promises of retribution. Only when they were completely out of sight did Clara lower the gun and realize she was shaking violently. She'd just made things worse, probably. George Penner didn't like being denied, and he really didn't like being denied by women he considered beneath him. When Jack returned 2 days later, Clara told him everything. She expected anger at her for escalating the situation, but instead his expression went cold and hard in a way she'd never seen. They threatened you, he said flatly. They threatened the ranch, Clara corrected. You are part of this ranch now, Jack said. A threat to you is a threat to everything. That night Jack taught her to shoot the rifle, a weapon with more stopping power than her little .32. He also moved his bedroll to the barn, saying he wanted to keep watch in case Harper came back. Clara knew she should protest the impropriety, but the truth was she felt safer knowing he was close. The next few weeks passed tensely, but without incident. Clara continued her work, getting better every day at the dozens of skills ranch life required. She could now rope a calf, if not elegantly, then at least effectively. She could tell when an animal was sick before symptoms became obvious. She'd delivered her first calf, a messy and miraculous experience that had left her covered in blood and fluid, but exhilarated. "You're not the same woman who got off that train," Martha Henderson observed one day when Clara came to town for supplies. Clara looked at herself in the store's mirror. Martha was right. The soft Eastern woman was gone. In her place stood someone harder, leaner, tougher. Her hands were rough, her skin tanned despite the winter sun, her body strengthened by constant work. But more than the physical changes, there was something different in her eyes: confidence, capability, a knowledge of her own worth that had nothing to do with others' opinions. "No," Clara agreed, "I'm not." "Good," Martha said. "That woman wouldn't have survived what's coming." "What do you mean?" Martha glanced around, then leaned in closer. "George Penner's been buying up land all around Jack's ranch. He's also been spreading rumors, saying Jack only keeps you around for improper reasons. He's trying to destroy both your reputations." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "That's a lie." "Course it is. Anyone with eyes can see Jack Callahan treats you with nothing but respect. But truth doesn't matter much when a rich man starts talking. People believe what they want to believe." Clara left the store troubled. She thought the danger from George was physical, something that could be faced with guns and courage. But this was different. This was the kind of attack that could destroy lives without firing a shot. That evening, she found Jack sitting on the porch of the main house, staring at the mountains as the sun set behind them. "We need to talk," Clara said. "I know about the rumors," Jack said before she could continue. "Tom Rivers told me yesterday." "I should leave," Clara said, the words feeling like glass in her throat. "If I go, the rumors will stop. Your reputation will recover." Jack turned to look at her, and there was something in his eyes that made her heart stop. "Is that what you want? To leave?" "No," Clara admitted. "But I won't let my presence destroy what you've built here." Jack was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to the porch railing, gripping it with both hands. 5 years ago," he said quietly, "I was married. Her name was Elizabeth. We had a small farm in Kansas, nothing much, but it was ours. She died in childbirth, along with our son. After that, nothing mattered. I drifted, fought, nearly died a dozen times because I didn't care if I lived. Then Samuel Brennan found me drunk in a Denver saloon and offered me this chance. This ranch saved my life, gave me purpose again." He turned back to Clara. "When I saw you at that train station, standing up to George Penner despite being half his size, I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. Real courage. Not the kind that comes from not caring if you die, but the kind that comes from deciding to live on your own terms." "Jack," Clara started, but he held up a hand. "You asked why I gave you a chance. It wasn't charity, and it wasn't because you reminded me of my mother or myself. It was because you reminded me that strength isn't about size or power. It's about choosing to stand when everyone expects you to fall." "And now I'm bringing trouble to your door," Clara said. "No," Jack said firmly. "George Penner is bringing trouble. You're just the excuse. He's wanted this land for years, and he'd find another reason if you weren't here. The difference is, now I have someone worth fighting alongside." The word "alongside" hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Clara felt something shifting, like the moment before an avalanche when the whole mountainside holds its breath. "I won't run," Clara said finally. "Not from George Penner, not from rumors, not from anything." "Good," Jack said, "because I think we're about to be tested in ways we haven't imagined yet." He was right. The next morning they woke to find several of their cattle dead, shot in the night. No proof of who did it, of course, but the message was clear. George Penner was escalating. "We could go to the sheriff," Clara suggested. "Sheriff Daniels is George's cousin," Jack said grimly. "The law in these parts is whoever has the most money and guns." "Then what do we do?" Jack looked at her, this small woman who'd become so much more than the mail-order bride George Penner had rejected. "We get ready for a fight." and we make sure we're the ones left standing when it's over." As Clara stood beside him, looking at their dead cattle, she thought about how far she'd come from that train platform. She'd wanted a new life, a chance to be more than what Boston had allowed. She'd gotten that and more. She'd found her strength, her courage, and maybe, just maybe, something that might grow into love if they survived what was coming. The war for Jack's ranch, for Clara's future, for the right to exist on their own terms, was about to begin, and Clara Monroe, all 5 feet of her, was ready for it. The dead cattle were only the beginning. Over the next week, more disasters struck with the precision of a military campaign. Fence lines were cut in the night, allowing the remaining cattle to scatter across the frozen prairie. The well pump handle was broken, forcing Clara and Jack to haul water from the stream a quarter-mile away. Then came the fire that destroyed half their winter hay supply, the flames visible from town like a beacon announcing their vulnerability. Clara woke each morning expecting to find Jack packing his belongings, ready to admit defeat. Instead, she found him working harder than ever, repairing what could be repaired, salvaging what could be salvaged, his jaw set with a determination that seemed carved from the same stone as the mountains. "He wants us to break," Jack said one evening as they surveyed the damaged hay barn, "to give up and sell to him for whatever he offers. But land isn't just dirt and grass. It's what you build on it, what you bleed for. I've bled too much into this soil to hand it over to a man like George Penner." "We need help," Clara said, voicing what they both knew. "We can't fight him alone." "Who's going to help us?" Jack asked bitterly. "George owns half the territory through debt or fear. The other half doesn't want to make an enemy of him." Clara thought about Martha Henderson's words at the store, about the whispers and rumors. Then she had an idea. What if we don't fight him as enemies? What if we fight him as neighbors? Jack looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, George has been spreading rumors about us, about impropriety. What if we make those rumors work for us instead of against us?" "Clara!" Jack started, but she pressed on. "There's going to be a winter social at the church next Saturday. Everyone in the territory will be there. What if we go together, not as employer and employee, but as courting? It would make the rumors seem ridiculous, turn them into something respectable. And it might make people think twice about George's actions if they see us as a real couple trying to build something together." Jack was quiet for a long moment, and Clara could feel her cheeks burning. She'd essentially just proposed a false courtship, but even saying the words made her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with strategy. "That's not a terrible idea," Jack said slowly. "But are you sure you want to link your reputation to mine that way? Once people think we're courting, there's no taking it back without scandal." Clara looked at him in the fading light, this man who'd given her a chance when no one else would, who'd taught her strength she didn't know she had, who stood beside her now against impossible odds. "There are worse fates than being linked to you, Jack Callahan." Something shifted in his expression, a softness she rarely saw breaking through his stoic exterior. "All right then. Saturday, we go to the social. Together." The week leading up to the social was filled with a different kind of tension. Jack became almost shy around her, their easy working relationship suddenly complicated by the pretense they were about to undertake. Or was it pretense? Clara found herself studying him when he wasn't looking, noticing things she'd been too exhausted or focused to see before. The way his rare smiles transformed his weathered face, the gentleness in his hands when he worked with injured animals, the quiet humming that escaped him when he thought he was alone. On Saturday afternoon, Clara stood in her cabin, staring at the one good dress she'd brought from Boston. It was deep blue wool, nothing fancy by Eastern standards, but far nicer than anything she'd worn since arriving in Wyoming. Her hands, now rough and calloused, struggled with the tiny buttons. Her hair, usually pulled back in a practical braid, refused to cooperate with her attempts at a more elegant style. A knock at the door interrupted her frustration. "Clara? You ready?" Jack's voice carried a nervousness she'd never heard before. She opened the door and felt her breath catch. Jack had transformed himself as well. Gone were the worn work clothes and battered hat. He wore a black suit that must have been saved for special occasions, his hair neatly combed, his jaw freshly shaved. He looked younger, less weathered, almost vulnerable. "You clean up well, Mr. Callahan," Clara said, trying to keep her tone light. "You—" Jack started, then stopped, seeming to struggle for words. "You look beautiful, Clara. You always do. But tonight everyone will see what George Penner was too blind to notice." The ride to town was quiet, both of them lost in thoughts they weren't ready to share. The church was blazing with light, the sound of fiddle music and laughter spilling out into the cold night air. As they approached, Clara could feel the weight of impending scrutiny. "Ready?" Jack asked, offering her his arm. "As ready as someone can be for walking into a den of lions," Clara replied, taking his arm and finding comfort in its solid strength. The music stopped the moment they entered. Every head turned, every conversation died. Clara felt like a specimen under glass, examined and judged by dozens of eyes. Then Martha Henderson's voice boomed across the room. "Well, it's about time! I was wondering when you two would stop dancing around each other and dance together instead." The tension broke slightly, replaced by whispers and speculation. Jack led Clara further into the room, his hand covering hers on his arm, a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. George Penner was there, of course, holding court near the punch bowl with his circle of associates. His eyes narrowed when he saw them, his handsome face twisting with something that might have been rage or disgust. "Ignore him," Jack murmured. "We're here to dance, not to fight." And dance they did. Jack was surprisingly graceful for such a large man, leading Clara through waltzes and reels with a confidence that made her wonder about his life before Wyoming. Clara, who'd learned to dance in Boston's working-class dance halls, found herself matching him step for step, their bodies finding a rhythm together as natural as breathing. "People are staring," Clara whispered as they spun past a group of ranchers' wives. "Let them," Jack replied, his hand warm on her waist. "They're seeing something they didn't expect. Us, happy despite everything George has thrown at us." "Are we?" Clara asked before she could stop herself. "Happy." Jack looked down at her, and for a moment the mask of stoicism he usually wore slipped entirely. "I haven't been this happy in 5 years, Clara. Maybe longer." Before Clara could respond, the music ended, and George Penner was standing before them, his smile sharp as a blade. "What a charming picture," he said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. The hired help and her employer, playing at being equals. "Tell me, Miss Monroe, is this performance part of your job duties, or does it cost extra?" The room went silent again. Clara felt Jack tense beside her, ready to respond with fists rather than words. But this was her fight. "Mr. Penner," she said, matching his volume, "I understand you're confused by the concept of genuine affection, having never inspired it yourself. But not everyone needs to buy what others freely give." A ripple of shocked laughter went through the crowd. George's face flushed dark red. "You forget yourself, woman. You're nothing but a rejected mail-order bride who couldn't even manage that simple transaction correctly. And you're nothing but a man who measures worth by the pound," Clara shot back. "Tell me, Mr. Penner, how much does character weigh? How tall is integrity? What's the going price for courage? Because if those things mattered to you, you'd realize you're the one who comes up short." The crowd was no longer pretending not to listen. This was better entertainment than they'd had in months. George stepped closer, using his height to loom over Clara. "You think you're clever, don't you? You think batting your eyes at Callahan will protect you from what's coming? I own this territory, little girl. I decide who succeeds and who fails. And you're about to fail spectacularly." "The only spectacular failure here," Jack said, stepping between them, "is a man who has to threaten a woman to feel powerful. Touch her, threaten her again, even look at her wrong, and you'll answer to me, Penner, not with lawyers or hired guns, but man to man." "Is that a threat, Callahan?" "It's a promise. And unlike you, I keep mine." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Then Tom Rivers, the neighboring rancher, stepped forward. "Seems to me," Tom said slowly, "that we're at a church social, not a prize fight. Miss Monroe, would you honor me with a dance? My wife's been wanting to talk to Callahan about buying some of his cattle." It was a clear intervention, a side being chosen. Clara accepted Tom's hand gratefully, allowing him to lead her away from the confrontation. As they danced, she saw other ranchers approaching Jack, discussing business, making it clear that not everyone was under George's thumb. "That was brave, what you did," Tom said, as they moved through a simple two-step. "Stupid, maybe, but brave." "Sometimes they're the same thing," Clara replied. "George won't forget this. He'll make you pay. He's already trying. The question is whether we can outlast him." Tom was quiet for a moment, then said, "My father used to say that the measure of a person isn't how hard they can hit, but how many hits they can take and keep standing. You and Jack, you're still standing. That counts for something." The rest of the social passed in a blur of dances, conversations, and carefully navigated social waters. Clara noticed that while some people avoided them, clearly not wanting to anger George, others seemed drawn to them, perhaps admiring their defiance or simply enjoying the drama. As the evening wound down, Jack and Clara prepared to leave. They were almost to the door when Bill Harper appeared, George's foreman, whiskey heavy on his breath. "Enjoying your last dance, little lady?" he slurred. "Because after what's coming, you won't feel much like dancing." Jack moved toward him, but Clara caught his arm. "He's drunk and stupid. Don't give George the satisfaction of you starting a fight." Harper laughed. "Listen to your tiny whore, Callahan. She knows—" He never finished the sentence. Jack's fist connected with Harper's jaw, sending him crashing into a table of desserts. The room erupted in chaos. Women screaming, men shouting, some trying to separate the fighters, others joining in. "We need to leave," Clara said urgently, pulling Jack toward the door. "Now!" They made it to their wagon just as Sheriff Daniels appeared, George at his side. "Callahan," the sheriff called. "You're under arrest for assault." "He was defending my honor," Clara said quickly. "Harper called me a—" "He insulted me. Everyone heard it." "I didn't hear anything," the sheriff said with a smirk. "Did you, Mr. Penner?" "Not a thing," George said smoothly. "Just saw Callahan attack my foreman unprovoked." "That's a lie." Tom Rivers had followed them out, along with several other ranchers. "We all heard what Harper said. He got what he deserved." The sheriff looked uncomfortable now. Arresting Jack on George's word was one thing. Doing it in front of witnesses who contradicted that word was another. "Maybe everyone should just go home and cool off," the sheriff said finally. "We can sort this out when heads are clear." Jack climbed onto the wagon, helping Clara up beside him. As they drove away, Clara could hear George shouting at the sheriff, his plans clearly disrupted. "Thank you," Clara said quietly as they left town behind. "For what? Making things worse?" "For defending me. For making it clear that I'm not alone." Jack was quiet for a moment, then said, "You're never alone, Clara. Not anymore." They were halfway home when they saw the glow on the horizon. Fire, but not where the hay barn had been. This was coming from the direction of Clara's cabin. Jack urged the horses to a gallop, the wagon bouncing dangerously over the rough road. They arrived to find Clara's cabin fully engulfed in flames, the heat so intense they couldn't get close. All her possessions, her few remaining links to her old life, were turning to ash before her eyes. "My mother's Bible," Clara whispered, thinking of one of the few things she'd brought from Boston. Her picture. Jack pulled her against him as she started toward the inferno, holding her back from danger. "They're just things, Clara. You're what matters." They stood together watching the cabin burn, Clara pressed against Jack's chest, his arms around her in a gesture that was no longer pretense. This wasn't about showing the town they were courting. This was about two people facing disaster together. "They want me to run," Clara said into his shirt. "They think if they take everything, I'll give up." "Will you?" Jack asked softly. Clara pulled back to look up at him, her face illuminated by the dying fire. "Never. They can burn every building, kill every cow, destroy everything material, but they can't touch what really matters." "What's that?" "This," she said, gesturing between them. "What we're building. Not the ranch, not the buildings, but this partnership, this choice to stand together." Jack looked at her for a long moment, then made a decision that would change everything. "Move into the main house. Not the spare room. With me." Clara's eyes widened. Jack, that's... People will say... Let them say it. We're already pretending to court. George is escalating. I need you close to keep you safe, and... He paused, seeming to gather courage. And I want you close because when I thought you might be in that cabin, when I thought I might have lost you, I realized something. What? Clara's voice was barely a whisper. That this stopped being pretense for me the moment you stood up to Harper with that little gun of yours. Maybe before that. Maybe from the moment you refused to take George's money and walked away from that station with your head high. The confession hung between them like a living thing. Clara reached up, her small hand touching his weathered cheek. It stopped being pretense for me when you taught me to read the weather in the mountains. When you trusted me with your cattle, your ranch, your past. When you saw me not as something broken to be fixed or small to be protected, but as someone who could stand beside you. Jack leaned down, and Clara rose on her toes, and their lips met in a kiss that tasted of smoke and promise, of hardship faced and hardship yet to come. It was a kiss that sealed something more than romance. It was a pact, a joining of forces against whatever came next. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Jack rested his forehead against hers. They'll come harder now. This was just the beginning. Then we'll fight harder, Clara said. Together. They spent the rest of the night moving Clara's few salvaged possessions into the main house, setting up a defensive position for whatever came next. Jack taught Clara how to load and position rifles at strategic windows. Clara organized their supplies, planning for a siege if necessary. As dawn broke over the mountains, they stood together on the porch, looking out at their domain. The burned cabin was an ugly scar on the landscape, but the ranch still stood. The cattle, those that remained, were safe in the barn. They had food, weapons, and most importantly, they had each other. I need to tell you something, Jack said suddenly. About why I really came here. Why I was so broken when Samuel gave me this chance. You don't have to... Yes, I do. If we're going to face this together, really together, you need to know everything. He took a deep breath. After Elizabeth died, after I lost everything, I didn't just drift. I hunted the doctor who let her die. The man who was too drunk to help when she needed it. I found him in Denver and I almost killed him. Would have, if Samuel hadn't stopped me. He convinced me that living well was better revenge than murder. That building something good would honor Elizabeth's memory better than destroying something bad. Clara absorbed this, understanding now the darkness she sometimes saw in Jack's eyes. Do you still want revenge? No, Jack said, pulling her closer. Now I just want to protect what I have, what we have. This ranch, this life, this chance at something I never thought I'd feel again. Love? Clara asked softly. Love, Jack confirmed. If you'll have me, Clara. Not as your employer, not as your protector, but as your partner. In everything. Before Clara could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Many horses, moving fast. Jack grabbed his rifle, pushing Clara behind him, but she grabbed her own weapon and stood beside him instead. Together, remember? She said. The riders came into view, not George's men as expected, but Tom Rivers, Martha Henderson's son Jake, and several other ranchers Clara recognized from the social. They reined in at the porch, Tom tipping his hat. Morning, Jack? Miss Clara, we heard about the fire last night. Thought you might need some help. Why? Jack asked, suspicious of unexpected aid. Why risk Penner's anger? Tom dismounted, the others following suit. Because what George is doing to you today, he could do to any of us tomorrow. Because might doesn't make right. And because... He grinned. Because seeing Miss Clara here stand up to him at the social was the best entertainment we've had in years. Figured anyone with that much sand deserves backing. Martha Henderson's son spoke up. My ma sent supplies too. Said any woman who can go from Boston seamstress to Wyoming ranch hand in 3 months has earned some support. More riders appeared on the horizon. More neighbors, more people choosing sides. Not everyone in the territory, not even most, but enough. Enough to show that George Penner didn't own everything and everyone. This won't stop him, Jack warned them. He'll come at you too now. Let him try, Tom said. We've been under his boot too long, afraid of his money and influence. But seeing you two stand up to him, seeing that he can be defied, it reminded us that this is supposed to be free country. They spent the day rebuilding what had been destroyed, reinforcing what remained. Clara worked alongside the men, no one questioning her place or ability anymore. She'd proven herself in fire, both literal and metaphorical. As the sun set, the helpers departed, promising to return if needed. Jack and Clara stood alone again on their porch, looking out at the land they were fighting for. He'll come at night, Jack said, with everything he has. This is war now. Then we'd better be ready, Clara replied, checking her rifle with practiced ease. That night they took turns standing watch, but the attack didn't come. Nor the next night, nor the next. The waiting was almost worse than fighting would have been, the tension stretching their nerves to breaking. On the fourth night, Clara was on watch when she saw them, riders approaching without torches, trying to use darkness as cover. She fired a warning shot, waking Jack instantly. How many? He asked, all business. 10, maybe 12, coming from the east. They took their positions, rifles ready. The riders stopped just outside of rifle range, and George Penner's voice carried across the cold night air. Callahan, I'm here to make you one last offer. Take the money and leave, both of you, tonight, or stay and face the consequences. The only consequence I see, Jack called back, is you finally showing your true colors, Penner. Bringing an army to fight one man and one woman, real brave of you. That woman has been nothing but trouble since she arrived, George shouted. She's turned this whole territory upside down with her defiance. Good, Clara called out, making her presence known. It needed turning. And I'm just getting started. She punctuated her words with a shot that took off one of the riders' hats. The man cursed and nearly fell from his horse. You've made your choice then, George said coldly. Boys, burn it all. The riders charged forward, some carrying torches, others firing guns. Jack and Clara responded with careful, aimed shots, not trying to kill but to discourage, to drive back. Clara hit one man in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. Jack's shot caught another in the leg, but there were too many, coming from multiple directions. Just when it seemed they'd be overwhelmed, more gunfire erupted, but not aimed at them. Tom Rivers and the others had returned, taking George's men by surprise from behind. The battle was brief but vicious. When the smoke cleared, several of George's hired guns were wounded, none of Jack's allies seriously hurt. George himself sat on his horse, his perfect clothes now disheveled, his face a mask of rage. This isn't over, he snarled. Yes, it is, a new voice said. Sheriff Daniels rode up, but not alone. With him was a U.S. Marshal, badge gleaming in the moonlight. Marshal Thompson, the lawman introduced himself. I've been investigating reports of land fraud and intimidation in this territory. Seems I arrived just in time to witness an attempted arson and assault. George's face went pale. Marshal, I can explain. Save it for the judge, the marshal said. Sheriff Daniels here has been very helpful in documenting your various activities, Mr. Penner. Seems he got tired of being under your thumb. The sheriff looked ashamed but determined. I've done things I'm not proud of, looked the other way too many times, but attempted murder is where I draw the line. As George and his men were led away, the marshal approached Jack and Clara. You two have caused quite a stir. There are reports from as far as Cheyenne about the tiny woman who stood up to the territory's biggest bully. I'm not that tiny, Clara protested, which made everyone laugh. No, ma'am, the marshal agreed. In the ways that count, you're about 10 feet tall. Dawn was breaking as the last of the riders departed. Jack and Clara stood alone on their porch once again, exhausted but victorious. The ranch was safe. They were safe. And more than that, they were together. So, Clara said, leaning against Jack's solid warmth, what now? Now we build, Jack said. We make this ranch what it should be. We prove that size and money don't determine worth. He paused, then added, and maybe we make that courtship official, if you're willing. Clara looked up at him, this man who'd seen her not as too small but as just right, who'd stood beside her against impossible odds, who'd offered her not rescue but partnership. Jack Callahan, are you proposing? I'm proposing a merger, he said with that rare smile. Equal partners in all things. The ranch, the work, the life. What do you say, Clara Monroe? Will you marry a broken-down rancher who was smart enough to see what George Penner was too stupid to recognize? What's that? That the best things come in small packages. That strength isn't measured in inches. That you, Clara Monroe, are worth more than all the land in Wyoming. Clara reached up, pulling his head down for a kiss. Yes, she said against his lips. Yes to all of it. As the sun rose fully, painting the mountains gold, they stood together planning their future. There would be challenges ahead. George might be arrested, but his influence would take time to fully break. The ranch needed rebuilding, the herd restocking. There would be those who never accepted Clara, who would always see her as too small, too Eastern, too different. But none of that mattered. She'd come to Wyoming to become someone's wife, to fit into someone else's vision of what she should be. Instead, she'd become herself. Clara Monroe, rancher, fighter, survivor. She'd found love not by making herself larger, but by refusing to be made small. The wolves howled in the distance as they always did, but Clara no longer heard threat in their voices. She heard wildness calling to wildness, strength recognizing strength. She was home, not in a place, but in a partnership. Not in safety, but in the courage to face danger together. And that was worth more than all the promises George Penner's letters had ever contained. The marshal's arrival should have meant peace, but Clara learned quickly that justice and resolution were two different things entirely. George Penner was released on bail within 3 days, his lawyers arguing that the night raid had been a misunderstanding between neighboring ranchers. He returned to his grand estate, wounded in pride but far from defeated, like a snake that had been stepped on but not killed. He'll be more dangerous now, Jack warned as they watched storm clouds gather over the mountains. A cornered animal is always the most vicious. Clara was mending harnesses in the barn, her small fingers now expert at working the thick leather. 3 weeks had passed since the night battle. 3 weeks of relative quiet that felt more like a held breath than true peace. Then we need to be ready for whatever he brings. What George brought was something neither of them expected. Lawyers from Denver, armed with papers instead of guns. They arrived on a cold December morning, their city clothes looking absurd against the harsh landscape, but their expressions were serious as undertakers. Mr. Callahan, the lead lawyer, a thin man named Fitzgerald, said, I'm here regarding the deed to this property. There seemed to be some irregularities. Jack's face went hard as granite. This land was bought fair and square from Samuel Brennan. I have the papers. Yes, about that, Fitzgerald smiled thinly. Mr. Brennan, it seems, didn't actually have the right to sell this land. According to our research, he never properly filed the homestead claim. The land technically reverted to the territory, and Mr. Penner has filed a claim on it. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. This was worse than guns or fire. This was an attack on the very foundation of everything Jack had built. That's impossible, Jack said, but Clara heard the uncertainty in his voice. Samuel lived here for 20 years. Living somewhere and owning it are different things, Mr. Callahan. You have 30 days to vacate or will be forced to pursue legal eviction. After the lawyers left, Jack slumped at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. Clara had never seen him look defeated before, not even when facing George's hired guns. Samuel warned me, he said quietly. When he was dying, he kept trying to tell me something about the papers, but he was so far gone with fever. I thought he was just rambling. There has to be a way to fight this, Clara said, her mind racing. The marshal can't help with civil matters. This is legal warfare, Clara, and George has more ammunition than we do. Clara stood up abruptly. No, I didn't come all this way, didn't fight this hard to lose everything to papers and legal tricks. There has to be something we can do. What? I don't have money for Denver lawyers. Everything I have is tied up in this land. Clara was quiet for a moment, then said, What about Samuel's things? Did he leave anything behind? Papers? Letters? Anything? Jack looked up. There's a trunk in the attic. I never went through it. Felt wrong somehow, but maybe. They climbed to the dusty attic, finding the old trunk covered in years of neglect. Inside were the fragments of Samuel Brennan's life. Photographs of people Jack didn't recognize, letters from Ireland, and at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, a collection of legal documents. Clara's eyes, trained by years of detailed seamstress work, caught what Jack might have missed. A faded document dated 1863, a proper homestead claim with an official seal. "Jack, look at this." Jack read it, his expression shifting from despair to confusion. "This is filed under a different name, Patrick O'Sullivan." They kept digging, and Clara found a letter that explained everything. Samuel Brennan had been Patrick O'Sullivan, an Irish immigrant who'd changed his name after some trouble in New York. The land was properly claimed, just under his original name. "This proves the land was his to sell," Clara said excitedly. "George's claim is worthless." But Jack shook his head. "It proves it to us." "But in court? George's lawyers will tear this apart, say we forged it, say there's no proof Samuel and Patrick were the same person." Clara refused to accept defeat. "Then we find proof. There has to be someone who knew Samuel when he was Patrick, someone who can testify." "Clara, that was over 20 years ago. Anyone who knew him then is probably dead or long gone." "Or they're right here," a voice said from below. They climbed down to find Martha Henderson standing in the kitchen, having let herself in as was her habit. "Sorry for eavesdropping, but when you get to my age, it's one of the few pleasures left." "Martha, did you know Samuel?" Clara asked urgently. "Know him?" "Girl, I was married to him for 3 years back in Kansas, before he became Samuel, before I became a Henderson." Martha sat heavily in a chair. "Patrick O'Sullivan was the wildest Irishman you ever met. Got in trouble with some powerful people in New York over union organizing, had to disappear. We went our separate ways. He came here, I remarried after word came he'd died. Imagine my surprise finding him alive and ranching when I moved here 15 years ago." Jack stared at her. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" "Wasn't my secret to tell. Patrick, Samuel, he'd built a new life. Who was I to disturb it? But I can surely testify that they were the same man if it comes to that." Clara felt hope surge through her. "Would you? Even if it means going against George?" Martha snorted. "Girl, I've been waiting 40 years for a chance to put George Penner in his place. His father was a bastard too, cheated my second husband out of his store. The Penners have been a blight on this territory for too long." Armed with this new information, Jack rode to town to telegraph the marshal, but when he returned, his expression was grim. "George has already filed the paperwork. The hearing is in 3 days in front of Judge Carlson." "George's friend," Clara said, her heart sinking. "His cousin, actually," Jack corrected. "We'll never get a fair hearing." That night, as they lay together in the bed they now shared, propriety be damned, Clara said, "What if we don't play by their rules?" "What do you mean?" "George expects us to show up in court, make our case to his cousin, lose gracefully. But what if we make it bigger than that? What if we make it public, so public that the judge can't just rubber stamp George's claim without consequences?" Jack turned to look at her in the moonlight. "How?" "We invite everyone. Every rancher, every farmer, every person in the territory who's ever been wronged by the Penners. We turn the courtroom into a stage, and we make George's greed so obvious that even his cousin can't ignore it." "That's dangerous, Clara." "If it doesn't work." "If it doesn't work, we lose everything anyway. At least this way, we go down fighting." The next 2 days were a whirlwind of activity. Clara and Jack rode to every neighboring ranch, every homestead, spreading the word. Tom Rivers promised to bring his entire family. The Hendersons would be there in force. Even people who'd been afraid of George before were beginning to murmur about standing up. The morning of the hearing, Clara dressed in her blue dress, the same one she'd worn to the church social. Jack wore his good suit. They looked like what they were, honest people trying to hold on to their home against a rich man's greed. The courthouse was packed. Judge Carlson, a thin man with nervous eyes, looked uncomfortable at the size of the crowd. George Penner sat with his lawyers, his expression confident, but his eyes showing the first hints of worry. Fitzgerald presented George's case smoothly. The missing paperwork, the irregular sale, the technical details that made Jack's ownership questionable. It was all very legal, very proper, very convincing if you didn't know the truth. Then it was their turn. Jack stood up, but Clara rose with him. "Your Honor," Jack began, "Excuse me," Judge Carlson interrupted. "Who is this woman?" "My fiancée," Jack said firmly, "and co-owner of the ranch." "Women can't own property unless they're widowed or specifically deeded," George's lawyer protested. "Then consider me a witness," Clara said, her voice carrying through the courtroom. "A witness to the truth that George Penner is trying to steal through legal trickery what he couldn't take through force." The judge banged his gavel. "Young woman, you're out of order." "This whole proceeding is out of order," Clara shot back. "Your Honor is sitting in judgment of a case involving his own cousin." "How is that justice?" The crowd murmured agreement. The judge's face reddened. "One more outburst and I'll have you removed." Clara sat down, but the damage was done. The crowd was restless, aware now of the connection if they hadn't been before. Jack presented the documents they'd found, and Martha Henderson testified about Samuel's true identity. The judge looked increasingly uncomfortable as the truth emerged, but George's lawyer was ready. "This is all hearsay," Fitzgerald argued. "An old woman's memories and convenient documents that suddenly appear? Your Honor, this is clearly a desperate attempt to hold on to land they know isn't theirs." It was going badly. Clara could see it in the judge's expression. He wanted to rule for George, but was looking for an excuse that wouldn't make it too obvious. Then the courtroom door opened, and a man Clara didn't recognize walked in. He was elderly, well-dressed, with the bearing of someone important. George went pale when he saw him. "Your Honor," the man said, "I'm Judge William Morrison from the Territorial Supreme Court. I understand there's a land dispute being heard here today." Judge Carlson stood up nervously. "Judge Morrison, this is unexpected. This is a simple property matter involving a judge related to one of the parties," Morrison said coldly. "I've received numerous complaints about irregularities in this court. I'll be observing today's proceedings." The entire atmosphere of the room changed. Judge Carlson couldn't simply hand George the victory now, not with his superior watching. "Perhaps," Carlson said weakly, "we should review all the evidence more carefully." What followed was actual justice. The documents were examined properly. Martha's testimony was given weight. Other ranchers stood up to testify about George's pattern of using legal manipulation to steal land. Tom Rivers talked about how George had tried the same thing with his father's ranch 10 years earlier. Finally, Clara stood up again. "Your Honor, Your Honors," she said, acknowledging Morrison. "I came to this territory as a mail-order bride, promised a new life. George Penner rejected me for being too small, said I wasn't worth the train fare it took to bring me here. But this land, this ranch, Jack Callahan, they gave me a chance to prove that worth isn't measured in size or wealth, but in work and courage and determination. George Penner wants to take that away not because he needs this land, but because he can't stand that someone he deemed worthless has thrived without him." She pulled out the letter George had originally sent her, the one she'd kept. "This is the kind of man George Penner is. He makes promises he doesn't keep, judges people by their appearance, and destroys what he can't control. Is that the kind of person this court wants to reward?" George stood up, his face purple with rage. "You little—" "Mr. Penner," Judge Morrison said sharply, "control yourself or be held in contempt." George sat down, but his hands were clenched into fists. Judge Carlson, sweating now, cleared his throat. "After reviewing all the evidence, the court finds that the sale from Samuel Brennan, also known as Patrick O'Sullivan, to Jack Callahan was legitimate and legal. The claim by Mr. Penner is dismissed." The courtroom erupted in cheers. Clara felt her knees go weak with relief, and Jack's strong arm went around her, holding her up. But George wasn't done. As people celebrated, he pushed through the crowd to confront them. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You think you've won? I still own half this territory. I can make your lives hell. No one will buy your cattle, sell you supplies, or help you with anything." "Actually," Judge Morrison said, having overheard, "that brings me to the other reason I'm here. Mr. Penner, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. The federal investigation into your activities has been ongoing for months. Your testimony today, threatening economic warfare against these people, was the final evidence we needed." George was hauled away in handcuffs, screaming threats and promises of revenge. But his empire was crumbling. Without his freedom, without his ability to intimidate, his power evaporated like morning mist. That evening, the ranch was full of people celebrating. The Hendersons, the Rivers family, even Judge Morrison stayed for dinner. Clara cooked with the other women, the kitchen full of laughter and stories. She belonged here now, not as an outsider trying to fit in, but as part of the community's fabric. As the party wound down and guests began leaving, Tom Rivers pulled Jack aside, but Clara could hear their conversation. "That woman of yours," Tom said, "she's something special." When she stood up in that courtroom, fearless as a mountain cat, I thought to myself, that's the kind of person this territory needs. You're a lucky man, Callahan. "I know," Jack said simply. Later, after everyone had gone, Jack and Clara stood on their porch, looking at their land, truly theirs now, legally and completely. "We should rebuild the cabin," Jack said. "For guests, or maybe—" He trailed off. "Maybe for children someday?" Clara finished softly. Jack pulled her closer. "Would you want that? Children, I mean, after everything with Elizabeth." "Jack," Clara said, turning in his arms to face him, "what happened to Elizabeth was a tragedy, but it wasn't your fault. And yes, I want children. I want to raise them here, on this land we fought for. I want to teach them that strength comes in all sizes, that courage matters more than appearance, that love is worth fighting for." "Marry me," Jack said suddenly. "Not someday. Not after we've rebuilt. Tomorrow. This week. As soon as we can get the preacher here. I don't want to wait any longer to make you my wife." Clara laughed, the sound bright in the cold night air. "Jack Callahan, that's the worst proposal I've ever heard. No romance, no knee, no ring." Jack dropped to one knee right there on the porch, pulling something from his pocket. It was a simple gold band, worn and old. "This was my mother's," he said. "I've been carrying it for weeks, waiting for the right moment. But every moment with you feels right. Clara Monroe, you came here to marry a man who didn't deserve you. Would you settle instead for one who knows exactly how precious you are?" "Yes," Clara said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, but I'm not settling, Jack. I'm choosing." They were married 3 days later in the same church where they'd first danced together as a pretend couple. The building was packed again, but this time the atmosphere was joyful. Martha Henderson stood as Clara's witness, tears streaming down her weathered face. Tom Rivers stood for Jack. The preacher, young and nervous, asked if anyone objected to the union. "Yeah," called out old Pete from the back, a grizzled prospector everyone knew. "I object that it took them this damn long to figure out what everyone else could see." The church erupted in laughter, and even the preacher smiled. As they exchanged vows, Clara thought about the journey that had brought her here. She'd been rejected for being too small, dismissed as worthless, nearly broken by those who saw her size as weakness. But she'd survived. More than that, she'd thrived. "I, Clara Monroe, take you, Jack Callahan, to be my husband," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I promise to stand beside you through storms and sunshine, through abundance and want, through whatever this territory throws at us. I promise to be your partner in all things, to never let you face troubles alone, to build with you a life worth living on this land worth fighting for." Jack's voice was rough with emotion as he gave his vows. "I, Jack Callahan, take you, Clara Monroe, to be my wife. You've already proven you can face down bulls and bad men, storms and setbacks. You've shown me that strength isn't about size, but about spirit. I promise to never underestimate you, to always trust in your courage, to love you not in spite of your size, but because everything about you, exactly as you are, is perfect." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Jack swept Clara up into his arms for the kiss, lifting her off her feet entirely. The congregation cheered, and Clara heard someone say, "Look at that! Turns out she was just the right size after all." The reception was held at the ranch, tables set up in the barn, lanterns strung from the rafters. There was dancing and drinking, storytelling and laughter. George Penner's former supporters were notably absent, but no one missed them. This was a gathering of people who understood that worth wasn't measured in dollars or acres, but in character. As the night wore on, Clara found herself standing outside, looking at the stars. Martha Henderson joined her, slightly tipsy from the whiskey. "You know," Martha said, "when you first got off that train, I thought you were done for. Too small, too soft, too Eastern. But you've got something in you, girl. Something that can't be measured or weighed. Stubbornness? Clara suggested with a smile. Grit, Martha corrected. Pure, undiluted grit. You're going to do well here, Clara Callahan. You and Jack both. As if summoned by his name, Jack appeared, wrapping his arms around Clara from behind. Mrs. Callahan, he said, and Clara shivered at the sound of her new name. Our guests are asking for another dance. They returned to the barn, where the fiddler struck up a waltz. As they danced, Clara noticed how perfectly they fit together now. Not because she'd grown taller or he'd grown shorter, but because they'd learned to move as one, to compensate for their differences, to make those very differences their strength. Do you ever wonder, Clara asked as they spun past their cheering friends, what would have happened if George had accepted me at the station? Jack's arms tightened around her. You'd have been miserable. He'd have tried to make you into something you're not, and I'd have lived the rest of my life alone, never knowing what I was missing. So we should thank him? Never, Jack said firmly. We succeeded despite him, not because of him. Although, he grinned, if you want to send him a letter in prison telling him about our happiness, I wouldn't object. Clara laughed. That would be petty. Deservedly petty. The party continued late into the night, but eventually the guests departed, leaving Jack and Clara alone in their home, truly their home now, legally and emotionally. As they prepared for bed, Clara found herself looking in the mirror again as she had that first morning months ago. The woman looking back was completely different. Still small, yes, but strong now. Her hands were rough, her skin tanned, her body lean with muscle. But more than the physical changes, there was something in her eyes, confidence, certainty, belonging. What are you thinking? Jack asked, coming up behind her. I'm thinking about that scared girl who got off the train, who thought her only value was in being chosen by someone else. She had no idea what she was capable of. She was always capable, Jack said. She just needed the chance to prove it. And someone who believed she could, Clara added, turning in his arms. Outside, a winter storm was building, wind howling through the valley like George Penner's threats once had. But inside, the house was warm and solid, filled with love and promise. Tomorrow we start rebuilding, Jack said. New cabin, bigger barn, more cattle. It'll be hard work. When has it ever been anything else? Clara replied. But we'll do it together. As they lay in bed, Clara thought she heard wolves howling in the distance, but the sound no longer frightened her. She was part of this landscape now, as wild and untamed as the territory itself. She'd been tested by fire, literal and metaphorical, and emerged stronger. Jack? She said into the darkness. I want to put up a sign at the entrance to our ranch. What kind of sign? One that says Monroe Callahan Ranch, where worth isn't measured in inches. Jack's laughter rumbled through his chest. George would hate that. Good, Clara said with satisfaction. They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, while outside the storm raged. But storms didn't frighten them anymore. They'd weathered worse and would weather whatever came next. The small woman from Boston had found her place in the vast Wyoming territory, not by becoming bigger, but by refusing to be made small. And that, Clara thought as sleep took her, was the greatest victory of all. In the months that followed, the ranch prospered. Without George Penner's interference, other ranchers were eager to do business with Jack and Clara. Their cattle sold well, their reputation grew, and slowly but surely they rebuilt everything that had been destroyed and more. Clara became known throughout the territory not as Penner's reject, but as the little woman with the big spirit. Women came to her for advice, men tipped their hats with genuine respect, and children loved her because she proved that being small didn't mean being weak. One spring morning, as Clara was feeding the chickens, she felt a flutter in her belly that had nothing to do with nerves. She placed her hand over her stomach, a smile spreading across her face. Jack, she called, and something in her voice made him come running from the barn. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, Clara said, taking his hand and placing it on her stomach. Everything's about to get bigger. It took him a moment to understand, then his face transformed with joy and terror in equal measure. A baby. A baby, Clara confirmed. Due in the fall, I think. Jack swept her up, spinning her around before suddenly stopping, afraid of hurting her. Clara laughed at his caution. "I'm pregnant, not broken," she said. "I can still work, still ride, still shoot if necessary." "Clara Callahan," Jack said, setting her down gently. "You never stop amazing me." As Clara looked out at their land, their cattle, their life built from rejection and determination, she thought about the child growing within her. Boy or girl, tall or short, they would grow up knowing that strength came from within, that size was just a number, that love was worth fighting for. The story that had begun with a rejection at a train station had become something neither Jack nor Clara could have imagined. A testament to the power of looking beyond appearances, of second chances, of finding perfection in what others called flaws. The summer heat had settled over Wyoming like a heavy blanket, and Clara's pregnancy was becoming more visible with each passing week. Despite Jack's protests, she continued working the ranch, though she'd made some concessions to her condition, using a mounting block more often, letting Jack handle the heavier lifting, and taking afternoon rests when the sun was at its worst. It was during one of these rest periods that Martha Henderson arrived with news that would shatter their hard-won peace. "George Penner's been released," Martha said without preamble, settling her considerable bulk into the kitchen chair. "His lawyers got the federal charges reduced, and with time served, he's out." Clara's hand went instinctively to her belly, where the baby kicked as if sensing her distress. Jack's face hardened into the mask she remembered from their early days. "Where is he?" Jack asked. "Nobody knows for certain. He lost most of his holdings paying legal fees, but he still has friends, still has enough money to cause trouble." Martha looked at Clara meaningfully. "And word is, he blames you for everything. You especially, Clara." That night, Jack wanted to send Clara to town, to stay with the Hendersons until they knew George's intentions. Clara refused. "We've built this life together," she said firmly. "I won't run now, not when we're so close to everything we dreamed of. Clara, you're pregnant. Our child needs parents who stand their ground, not ones who flee its shadows." She took his face in her small hands. "George Penner took enough from us. He doesn't get to take our peace, too." But peace was hard to maintain when signs of George's presence began appearing. First, it was small things: fence posts knocked over, water troughs contaminated with dead animals, tools going missing. Then one morning, Clara found something that made her blood run cold. A tiny dress, the kind made for a baby, hanging from their gate with a note that read, "Some things are too small to survive out here." Jack wanted to hunt George down, but Clara stopped him. "That's what he wants. To make you leave. To make you vulnerable. We're stronger here. Together." They hired 2 ranch hands, brothers named Luis and Miguel, who'd worked for other ranchers George had destroyed. They were good with guns and better with cattle, and most importantly, they had their own reasons for wanting to see George stopped. "He destroyed our father's ranch in Colorado," Luis explained. "Claimed water rights that weren't his, dried up our streams. Papa died of heartbreak, watching his land turn to dust. The brothers moved into the rebuilt cabin, keeping watch in shifts. Clara taught them her shooting technique, which made them laugh at first, until she outshot both of them at 20 paces. Size isn't everything," Miguel admitted, properly chastised. "It's nothing at all," Clara corrected. "Heart is everything." July turned to August, and Clara's pregnancy advanced. She could no longer ride Buttercup, could barely manage the walk to the chicken coop some days. But her spirits remained strong, especially when she felt the baby moving, this life she and Jack had created in defiance of everything that had tried to break them. It was during a particularly hot afternoon that Tom Rivers arrived with troubling news. "George has been gathering men," he said. "Drifters, gunfighters, the kind who'll do anything for money. Word is, he's planning something big." "How many?" Jack asked. "Maybe 15, maybe 20. Too many for you to fight, even with the Gonzalez brothers." That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She stood at the window watching the moon paint the mountains silver when she saw them. Riders, moving through their land like shadows. Not attacking, just watching, letting them know they were surrounded. "They're trying to scare us," Jack said, standing beside her with his rifle. "It's working," Clara admitted. "Not for me, but for this one." She placed her hand on her belly. I can face anything for myself, but risking our child— We won't have to, Jack said with sudden decision. Tomorrow, we end this. How? The way it should have been ended at that train station. Man to man, or in this case, man to woman to man. The next morning, Jack sent word through Tom Rivers. A meeting at noon at the old cottonwood tree that marked the boundary between what had been Pennerland and the Callahan Ranch. George could bring 2 men, Jack would bring Clara and 1 other. It's a trap, Luis warned. Everything with George is a trap, Jack agreed, but sometimes you spring the trap to catch the trapper. Clara insisted on going despite being 7 months pregnant. This started with me at a train station. It needs to end with me too. They arrived at the cottonwood to find George already there, flanked by Bill Harper, his jaw still crooked from Jack's punch at the social, and a gunfighter Clara didn't recognize. George looked different, prison having aged him badly. His once perfect clothes were now slightly shabby, his handsome face gaunt and marked by bitterness. The happy couple, George sneered. And breeding already? I see. Though I can't imagine what kind of runt someone your size will produce, Clara. The kind that will grow up knowing their worth isn't measured by their size or their wealth, Clara replied evenly. The kind you'll never be able to intimidate or buy. George's face darkened. You took everything from me. You took everything from yourself, Clara corrected. Your greed, your cruelty, your need to make others small so you could feel big. I just refused to play along. Enough talking, Jack interrupted. What do you want, George? You didn't call us here for philosophy. George smiled, and it was an ugly thing. I want what I've always wanted. The land that should have been mine. But I'll settle for something else. He looked directly at Clara. A duel. You humiliated me, destroyed my reputation, took my freedom, face me with guns, and we'll settle this once and for all. She's pregnant, you bastard, Jack snarled, stepping forward. Then you face me, George said, unless you're too cowardly to fight for your woman. It was an old trap, masculine pride as bait, but before Jack could respond, Clara spoke. I'll face you, she said calmly. Everyone turned to stare at her. George laughed. You? You can barely walk, swollen as you are. I can shoot, Clara said. That's all a duel requires, unless you're afraid to face a pregnant woman who's 5 feet tall. The challenge hung in the air. George's men shifted uncomfortably. To refuse would be cowardice. To accept would be monstrous. Either way, George's reputation would suffer. Choose your weapon, George said finally, his voice tight. Words, Clara said, surprising everyone. We duel with words, here and now. You tell your truth, I'll tell mine, and let everyone here judge who wins. That's not a duel, Harper protested. It's the only kind that matters, Clara said. Violence just proves who's stronger or faster or luckier. Words prove who's right. George laughed bitterly. Fine. You want words? Here are mine. You're a fraud, Clara Monroe. Callahan, Clara corrected. Whatever you call yourself, you came here pretending to be something you weren't, tricked Jack into taking you in, turned the whole territory against me with your lies. What lies? Clara interrupted. That I was exactly who I said I was in my advertisement? That I was willing to work? That I refused to be sent away like unwanted goods? You were unwanted goods, George shouted. Too small, too weak, too much for you to handle, Clara finished. That's the real truth, isn't it, George? Not that I was too small, but that I was too strong. You saw it that day at the station. I wouldn't cry, wouldn't beg, wouldn't take your money and slink away. And that terrified you because if a woman my size could stand up to you, what did that say about your power? George's hand went to his gun, but Jack and Luis drew faster, their weapons aimed at his heart. Let her finish, Jack said coldly. Clara continued, her voice carrying across the prairie. You want to know the real difference between us, George? You inherited everything, your land, your money, your position. It was all given to you, and you used it to make others feel small. I earned everything, every callus, every skill, every ounce of respect. I built myself up without tearing anyone else down. She took a step closer, despite Jack's warning hand. You called me too small for ranch work, but I've birthed calves and broken horses. You said I wouldn't survive the winter, but I survived your attacks. You said no one would respect me, but look around. Who has respect now? George's face was purple with rage, but Clara wasn't finished. You know what the saddest part is, George? If you'd accepted me that day, if you'd given me a chance, I would have been a good wife to you. I would have worked hard, been faithful, tried to make you happy. But you couldn't see past your own prejudices, and because of that, you lost everything. Not to me, but to yourself. Enough, George roared, drawing his gun despite the weapons pointed at him. But he didn't aim at Clara or Jack. He put the gun to his own head. You've taken everything. My land, my reputation, my life. No! Clara stepped forward, her small hand reaching out. George, don't. This isn't the way. Why do you care? He asked, the gun shaking in his hand. After everything I've done to you. Because, Clara said softly, taking your life won't give you back what you've lost, and it won't give me anything I've won. You're not evil, George. You're just broken. And broken things can be fixed if they're willing to be mended. For a long moment, everything hung in balance. Then George lowered the gun, his shoulders sagging in defeat. I have nothing left. You have your life, Clara said. That's more than you were going to leave me with. Start over, George. Somewhere else, as someone else. Learn what it means to build instead of tear down. George looked at her, this tiny woman who'd destroyed him with her refusal to be destroyed. Why show me mercy? Because someone showed me mercy once, Clara said, glancing at Jack. When I had nothing and was nobody, Jack Callahan gave me a chance. That chance changed everything. Maybe mercy can change you too. George holstered his gun with shaking hands. Without another word, he mounted his horse and rode away, Harper and the gunfighter following. They never saw him again, though years later Clara would hear rumors of a reformed rancher in California who helped struggling farmers, a man who'd learned that true strength came from lifting others up. As they rode home, Jack said, You could have let him pull that trigger. No one would have blamed you. I would have blamed me, Clara replied. Besides, the best revenge isn't watching your enemy fall. It's rising so high they have to crane their necks to see you. That night, as if the baby sensed the danger had passed, Clara went into labor. It was too early, too soon, and fear gripped the ranch. Martha Henderson came, bringing her midwife knowledge, while Jack paced the floor like a caged animal. It's like her, Martha muttered as the hours passed, too impatient to wait for the proper time. The labor was hard, complicated by the baby's early arrival and Clara's small frame. There were moments when Jack thought he would lose them both, moments when Clara's screams tore through him worse than any bullet could. I can't lose her, he told Martha desperately, not like Elizabeth. I can't survive it again. Then don't let her hear that fear, Martha said sharply. She needs your strength now, not your worry. Jack went to Clara, taking her small hand in his large one. You're the strongest person I know, he told her. You faced down George Penner, survived everything he threw at us. You can do this. It's too big, Clara gasped between contractions. The baby's too big. Then we'll make room, Jack said, just like you made room for yourself in this territory. Push, Clara. Fight. Show this baby how Callahans come into the world, fighting and winning. Dawn was breaking when the baby finally arrived, a girl, small but perfect, with Clara's auburn hair and Jack's serious eyes. She was tiny, barely 5 pounds, but her cry was strong and fierce. What should we name her? Jack asked, cradling his daughter like she was made of spun glass. Elizabeth, Clara said, exhausted but smiling. Elizabeth Hope Callahan. For the past that shaped you and the future we're building. Martha, checking the baby, laughed. She's small, like her mama. Some folks might say too small. Some folks would be wrong, Clara said firmly, taking her daughter into her arms. She's exactly the right size. The news of Elizabeth Hope's birth spread quickly through the territory, and with it, the story of Clara's final confrontation with George Penner. It became legend, embellished with each telling, the tiny pregnant woman who defeated the territory's biggest bully with words instead of weapons, who showed mercy when she had every right to seek vengeance. Visitors came to see the baby and stayed to marvel at how the ranch had transformed. What had once been a modest operation was now thriving, with healthy cattle, expanded pastures, and new buildings rising from the ashes of the old. Jack and Clara had hired more hands, including 2 women from town who'd been widowed and needed work. "You're building something different here," Tom Rivers observed one day. "A place where size and strength aren't the only measures of worth." "It's the only way I know how to build," Clara replied, watching her daughter sleep in the cradle Jack had carved. "From the ground up, with everyone welcome who's willing to work." Fall arrived with its golden light and cooling winds. Elizabeth Hope grew stronger each day, though she remained small for her age. Clara would hold her daughter and tell her stories about the train station, about learning to shoot, about facing down wolves and fires and evil men. "You come from strong stock," she would whisper. "Not big stock, but strong stock. Never let anyone tell you you're too small for anything." One evening, as the first snow began to fall, Jack found Clara standing at the window, Elizabeth Hope in her arms, watching the flakes drift down. "What are you thinking?" he asked, wrapping his arms around both of them. "I'm thinking about that woman who got off the train last year, how certain she was that her life was over when George rejected her. She had no idea what was beginning." "Beginning?" Clara turned in his arms, looking up at him with eyes full of love and contentment. "This, you, Elizabeth, the ranch, a life built not on what others thought I should be, but on what I chose to become." "And what did you choose to become?" Jack asked, though he knew the answer. "Myself," Clara said simply. "Just myself, at exactly the right size." That winter was hard, as Wyoming winters always were, but they were prepared for it. The ranch hands worked together like family. The cattle were healthy and protected, and the house was warm with love and laughter. Elizabeth Hope grew steadily, if slowly, already showing signs of her mother's determination and her father's steadiness. Spring brought unexpected visitors, a group of women from back east, mail-order brides on their way to various destinations. They'd heard Clara's story and stopped to meet the woman who'd become famous for refusing to be rejected. "Were you really only 5 feet tall?" one young woman asked, as if Clara might have grown since then. "Still am," Clara laughed, standing to demonstrate. "Height doesn't change, but everything else can, if you're willing to work for it." "What if we're rejected too?" another woman asked fearfully. Clara thought for a moment, then said, "Then you do what I did. You refuse to accept the rejection. You find another way, make another choice, build another life. The West is big enough for all of us, regardless of our size." She sent them on their way with supplies and advice, watching their wagon disappear into the distance. Some would find happiness with the men who'd sent for them. Others would find different paths, as she had. But all of them would remember the small woman who'd proved that worth wasn't measured in inches. As summer arrived, bringing with it the anniversary of Clara's arrival in Wyoming, Jack surprised her with a gift. A new sign for the ranch entrance, carved from solid oak, the Callahan Ranch, where small things grow strong. "It's perfect," Clara said, standing on her toes to kiss him. "Just like you," Jack replied. They hung the sign together, with Elizabeth Hope watching from her basket, gurgling happily in the sunshine. Neighbors came to admire it, and the story spread further. The ranch where size didn't matter, where determination did, where a woman too small had built something too big to fail. One day, as Clara was teaching the newer ranch hands how to read cattle behavior, a familiar figure appeared on the horizon. For a moment her heart clenched, thinking George had returned. But as the rider drew closer, she realized it was a woman, tall, elegant, everything Clara wasn't. "I'm looking for Clara Callahan," the woman said, dismounting gracefully. "Formerly Clara Monroe." "I'm Clara," she said, wary. The woman smiled, and it transformed her severe face. "I'm Catherine Penner, George's sister." Clara's hand went to the gun she still wore, but Catherine raised her hands peacefully. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to thank you." "Thank me." Clara couldn't hide her surprise. "George wrote to me from California. He's different, humbled. He told me what you said to him about broken things being mended. He's trying to mend himself, and he wanted me to tell you that you were right. Mercy did change him." Catherine stayed for dinner, sharing stories of George's childhood, helping Clara understand the man who'd caused her so much pain. Our father was cruel, she explained. He taught George that power meant making others feel powerless. You taught him something different. Before she left, Catherine said, George asked me to give you this. She handed Clara an envelope. Inside was the original letter George had sent, offering her a new life in Wyoming. And below it, in fresh ink, he'd written, You got your new life after all. Just not the way either of us expected. Thank you for showing me that rejection can be redirection. GP. Clara kept the letter, filing it with the other papers that documented her journey. It seemed fitting that it would end where it began, with a letter and a choice. Years passed. Elizabeth Hope grew into a spirited child, small like her mother, but fierce like both her parents. She could ride before she could properly walk, shoot before she could write, and stand up to bullies twice her size without flinching. Other children followed, James, who grew tall like his father but gentle like his mother, and the twins, Mary and Margaret, who fell somewhere in between. The ranch expanded, becoming one of the most successful in the territory, not through force or fraud but through hard work and fair dealing. Clara became something of a legend, her story told in parlors and saloons, schools, and churches. Women would travel from far away to meet her, to hear directly from her lips how she'd turned rejection into triumph. She always told them the same thing. Your worth isn't determined by anyone else's measure. You're not too anything, too small, too weak, too different. You're exactly enough, exactly as you are. On Elizabeth Hope's 5th birthday, they held a grand celebration at the ranch. The entire territory seemed to come, bringing gifts and good wishes. Tom Rivers, now gray-haired but still spry, raised a toast. To Clara Callahan, he said, who proved that the best things really do come in small packages. And to Jack, who was smart enough to see it. As Clara stood there, surrounded by friends and family, her children playing at her feet, her husband's arm around her shoulders, she thought about the woman who'd stepped off that train 6 years ago. That woman had wanted nothing more than to be chosen, to be accepted, to fit into someone else's vision of what a wife should be. This woman, weather-worn and work-hardened, small but mighty, had learned something better. She'd learned to choose herself, to accept her own worth, to create her own vision of what life could be. Mama, Elizabeth Hope tugged at her skirt, will you tell us the story? Which story, little one? The one about the train station, about how being rejected was the best thing that ever happened to you. Clara smiled, lifting her daughter onto her hip, despite Jack's protest that she would strain herself. It starts like this, she began, as she always did. Once upon a time, a woman who thought she was too small discovered she was exactly the right size. The children gathered around, even the ranch hands pausing in their work to listen, because everyone loved the story of how Clara Monroe became Clara Callahan, how rejection became redirection, how the smallest woman in Wyoming territory had built the biggest life. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Clara finished her story the way she always did. And she lived not happily ever after, because that's for fairy tales, but happily ever forward, building and growing and proving every single day that worth isn't measured in inches or pounds or dollars, but in courage and kindness and the willingness to keep standing no matter how many times you fall. Is that really how it ends, Mama? Elizabeth Hope asked. Clara looked at her daughter, at her family, at the life she'd built from the ashes of rejection. No, sweetheart. That's how it begins. Every single day, that's how it begins.